Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.
Southeast Radio.
While trips to their solicitor's office to discuss defamatory or controversial content that has been published is a regular occurrence for many journalists. But Conor Brady and his son Neil may have developed a solution for this very problem. Conor joins me now to discuss their tech startup, Caliber AI. Conor, I'd like to start the interview by discussing an expansive career which has brought you from the Irish Times to GSOC.
Good morning, Carl. Pleasure to be with you. Yes, indeed. I did nearly 20 years as editor of the Irish Times and then perhaps another 15 years on top of that in other journalistic roles. But I retired from the Irish Times in 2002. And since then, I've done a variety of roles for the state. I've spent, again, almost getting on for 20 years now, serving the state in various different ways, GSOC being the most recent one. A number of other academic posts as well. So this is something quite new for me, finding myself in my sere and yellow years chairing a cutting-edge technology company.
An exciting project for you. Now, talk to us about where the idea for Caliber AI came from.
Well, as you said, I had a long career in journalism and almost 20 years in the Irish Times as editor or deputy editor. And I suppose possibly the most searing aspect of my editorship, looking back, I just remember being dragged into court or dragged down to lawyers more often than I care to remember. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it's wearing and it's wearying. And in those days, we did have a lot of sub-editors in the paper, so a lot of stuff was cut before I ever got in. So, we were fairly well protected, but even so, it was a big burden. I then began to realize in more recent years, talking to contemporary editors and contemporary journalists, that in fact, with the changing of the business model in newspapers and broadcast media companies, the sub-editor was largely gone. So a lot of copy was actually going into the paper and going out on air and being published without actually going through what you would call any quality control. So my son Neil, who had worked with The Guardian and he was involved in the startup of Storyful, and then he went to work with the Institute of European Affairs here in Dublin, and he was in charge of their digital innovation program. So in conversation over time, this idea germinated that if we could marry the skills of experienced journalists and lawyers together with the power of artificial intelligence, we could construct a machine which would augment the quality control in modern news media. So we started off on a quite narrow base, something for newsrooms, newspapers, broadcasters, but the focus has now broadened into a wider span than that.
So, Conor, essentially, how does the service work?
Well, this will be available. It is available as of now as a plug-in. It'll sit on people's desktops or laptops or whatever, or their phones, in the same way that any other plug-in would. You're probably familiar with things like spell check and Grammarly, and which are essentially aids to accurate and good and good content. So it'll plug in. It will read the content as the journalist or the writer or the broadcaster feeds it into the screen, and if it detects content which is content, either individual words or phrases, which appear to the intelligence to be harmful or potentially toxic or indeed defamatory, it'll send a signal to the journalist or to the writer and say, look, hey, have a think about this. This has the potential to be received by somebody as harmful or toxic or dangerous.
Now, I think your timing is very, very good because we live in a very politically correct world now and people are hypersensitive to what's being said. So focus on the technology next. How does it detect, for instance, statements that may be considered as potentially toxic?
Well, it basically works off a database which we have put together over the last 2 years. The database has been wholly generated from our own resources, and we've drawn that data from editors, from journalists, from lawyers, from linguists, from linguistic analysts, from philosophers, from people who are accustomed to making, if you like, ethical decisions. So it's quite nuanced. It has to be. You're effectively interpreting people's thought processes, and you're trying to arbitrate between thought processes which are harmless and thought processes which may be seen as harmful. And of course, the oldest truism is that the content which one person generates and they don't think it's harmful may in fact be harmful in the eye of the person who receives it, or in the eye of the person to which it is directed. So really, as I see it, this technology, it's playing the electronic or digital equivalent role to that of the sub-editor who sat in the newsroom with a green eye shade over his or her eye, and checked reporters' copy and checked broadcasters' copy before it would go on air or before it would go into the newspaper, and if necessary raise an admonishing finger and say, hey, let's have a think about saying this in a slightly different way, or do you really want to say that, or do you understand how that could be misinterpreted?
And of course, as you said earlier, in your time at the Irish Times, you were quite frequently liaising with your solicitors in relation to potential defamation cases. And of course, the defamation laws here in Ireland are some of the most punitive in the world. And I'm just thinking about market reach for yourselves. What countries are you most focused on developing your service in?
Well, in terms of defamation, Carl, you're absolutely right. Irish defamation laws are the most stringent, probably in the world, and certainly in the Western world, and extremely punitive, of unforgiving of error. So we're looking at Ireland, we're looking at the UK, which is a big market. It's not as punitive as the Irish market, but it's still easy to get into trouble. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all of these countries are very litigious, and the cost of defamation and fighting defamation in the courts can be enormous. While the initial market focuses on defamation, it's a much wider concept than that.
And Conor, I know that Caliber AI has recently completed a funding round. What will you be using this investment for?
Well, yes, we're very fortunate indeed. We have a number of private individual investors from all of them from within Ireland. And we've also had, of course, matching investment from Enterprise Ireland. And I would have to say Enterprise Ireland have been fantastic. They've been a wonderful people to work with. Basically, we're talking about payroll and technology. We obviously have to hire technology. We've got to hire bandwidth. You need a lot of computer firepower to work this thing. So that doesn't come cheap. But the main thing really is salaries. At the moment, we've got 5 people on payroll. We've got a chief technical officer. We've got 2 computational linguists. We've got 2 annotators who actually process large volumes of content every week. And we also have 1 or 2 other people on a part-time consultancy working with users and evaluating the user experience. So it's basically payroll.
So Conor, what's your growth plan for the business over the next 3 to 5 years?
We see ourselves coming up pretty quickly now to Enterprise Ireland's HPSU, High Potential Startup, which means employing between 10 and 20 people. We see a turnover of, hopefully within 18 months, we want to see a turnover of something between $1 million and $1.5 million. But the potential is very considerable because the landscape legally is changing. Up to now, for example, social media have really not been made amenable for the content that they carry. So you can say what you like more or less on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and you're not going to have to face the music for it. But that is changing. So we think that the old, if you like, the Wild West days of the internet where you could say what you like and get away with it, those days are going to come to an end. There's going to be law and order on the digital streets. And if you say things that are harmful or toxic or damaging or defamatory, the likelihood is that you're going to have to account for that. And that's where we see the big market coming in for Caliber.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Conor Brady from Caliber AI. And I wish Conor and Neil every success with their growth plans for their tech startup.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Carl Fitzpatrick.
South